I will talk about what I call forbidden wisdom. So before the talk started, we talked about the war on drugs, which is actually, like Graham Hancock says, a war on consciousness. And so that's where the title may be inspired from. So first of all, I always say a little bit about the law from the country I come from. I come from France. Here we are in Switzerland, so my speech is a little bit more free. But in France, what's really interesting to know is that it's forbidden to talk about psychedelics in a positive manner. So for example, if you are on the French ground and you say LSD is good and can be therapeutic, then it's 3 years in jail and 75,000 euros of fine. But the law goes even further. The law says you cannot tell that you cannot speak about a legal substance and like is having the same property than an illegal substance. So you cannot give to a legal substance the psychedelic properties, publicly speaking. So for example, if you say, I don't know how you say in English, but muscatnuss, muscade en français should exist in English, I don't know the name of it, or saffron, for example, if you say it has psychedelic properties and it may, I don't know, enhance your cognition or whatever it is, you may face the same penalties like 3 years in jail and 75,000 euros of fine. So this is the situation. Also, there are many associations that calls that hindering of freedom of speech, okay? Because we have today scientific studies that says things, let's call them positive or therapeutic about psychedelics, but we are not allowed to tell it publicly because of the law. So of course, and maybe it's a good thing, it's also forbidden and punished by the same penalty, provocation to use. So just as an introduction, this talk and this speech is not here to encourage you to cross the cross the law in the country that you are in, of the country you are in. Okay, I base my approach about psychedelics on an initial observation. This is the first picture. We have a journalist here, presumed to be Graham Hancock, and he asks a native, and he asks, what's the problem with our world? And the native answers, you have severed the connection with the spirit. And we could talk a night long about what the spirit is. Some people call it the soul, other people call it God, whatever you want to put behind that name. We apparently lost something. And we can see that with the direction the world or our civilization is taking, something has been lost, and we can consider that we are going more and more into matter. And this also makes an echo with many of religious myths, like something is falling down, like something was falling from another place to another place. It's a fall of something. Then I always like to talk about 4 big collective traumas, which are domination, accumulation, conformism, and materialism. Domination can be seen as the trauma that comes from the danger that our ancestors, archaically speaking, may have faced towards nature, climate, disaster, predators, and also it led to a traumatic reaction to survive, and we had to dominate nature. One of the symptoms of domination is patriarchy, for example, but we behave as humans towards something we call nature, which is already almost a schizophrenic stance. Nature is out there So there is a dissociation, the traumatic dissociation here. Nature is not me, nature it's there, and we are not part of nature. So domination is a first traumatic reaction. Accumulation may come from the scarcity of the resources that our ancestor may have faced in the dark ages. And so we accumulate in a reaction of these transgenerational and very ancient trauma. Conformism comes from a very archaic part in the animal kingdom, in some species that are used to live in group, being excluded from the group. Look, for example, like wolves or other species like live. If you are excluded from the group, this means dying. It's pure death. You're not able to strive to survive. And conformism comes from that. We need to conform to the group to survive and be part of the group. You can see that in actual society. We are dominating, accumulating, conforming, and also materialism. Materialism may have different explanation, but for example, religion, not as the sacred meaning of religion, like religare in Latin means to connect with something bigger. But materialism, as it has been shown by institutional religions. Religions, when it starts to be an institution, says, stop having your spiritual experience with plants. We have a book for that. And you don't need anymore to take plants and be high, because we have the book, and the other ones say this is true, so now this is the law. It's a first step of materialism. Then the religion in its dogma was so far than science 300 years ago was an accurate answer. We stop about superstition, irrationality, because it's gone too far with the religious dogma. But what we may see, depending where is our point of view, is that science is also drifting to its own dogma, which is materialism. Okay? The considerate materialism, the materialistic science, can be considered as the attempt to explain every phenomenon of the world on the mechanistic level. If it can be measured, if it can be reproducible, then it's true. If not, then it's not true. This is also called, another way to call it, it's scientificism or scientism, which is science as a dogma. And where this stance, this dogmatic stance, is actually trying to confuse science and truth. And science is only a method. And there is a French astrophysicist, I like the sentence that he said when he said, science has no privileged relationship with truth. It's just a method. And so there is this growing confusion, especially supported by the media. And so we may have solutions from this trauma. Collaboration instead of domination, sharing instead of accumulation. And in front of conformism, we have many tools like art, tolerance, curiosity, and of course, towards materialism, we can return to transcendence, and we can also call that direct experience. Everybody knows that God doesn't lie in a book, but maybe more closer to a direct experience of reality and sometimes expanded reality. We don't know. We will see that together. So first notions, psychedelics or entheogen. We often hear these two words, but we don't really know the difference. So here is a proposal. The word entheogen has been popularized by the American government that needed to make a difference between something that they want to be legal and something that will stay illegal. Entheogen, you can realize, and the root of the word is like in theology, God, or entheo, enthusiasm, gen, who generates, and the prefix en, inside. So it should be about a substance that generates the feeling of God inside us. And psychedelic comes from revealing the psyche, the soul, or the spirit, whatever you want to call it. But something should be revealed by a substance that is psychedelic. But the American government, in its wave of legalization that is now more than 20 years old basically stated that an entheogen is a substance that has a traditional spiritual use, that has also an ancient use, religious use, and that has been, I don't know the exact term in English, but moderately modified by humans. And this is a little bit how do we say that? Blurry, okay, moderately modified. So ayahuasca is considered as an entheogen because it has a traditional use, and the modification is very moderate, okay? Peyote, San Pedro, all things that are taken from nature have a traditional and spiritual background as considered an entheogen. So you have many cities or states in the United States where the entheogens are legal, but psychedelics, LSD, or depends if you consider MDMA as a psychedelic, or ketamine, are still forbidden, are still illegal. So this is the difference, and maybe the word entheogen carries a more spiritual, transcendental, traditional meaning in itself. And also the word psychedelic has a different perception or definition regarding the domain you speak from, the point of view you speak from. Through a psychiatric lens, a psychedelic is a substance that acts on the serotoninergic circuit. So ketamine is not a psychedelic. But some people describe having very strong psychedelic experience with ketamine, or even with a drum, or even with singing, or with fasting, or whatever it is. So it's not only substances that are psychedelic, but also experience. Here, I don't want to frighten you with this diagram. It shows an attempt to map what are psychedelics. What is the most important thing here is not to try to know which is a psychedelic or not, is to see that the borders, the boundaries between categories there is a porosity. They are not really strict. And for example, you can see that there are a lot overlapping. So this is just an attempt to map. The most interesting insight here is to say, yeah, we can have probably psychedelic means psyche revealing, soul revealing experiences with substance that is technically not a psychedelic. And the opposite is also true. You can take a psychedelic experience and have an experience, psychedelic substance, and have an experience that is not at all psychedelic. So what does that mean finally? Yeah.
Cette partie-là, tu viens parler, tu peux le traduire en français.
Oui.
C'est important.
Je disais que ce qui est important avec ce graphique-là, c'est pas de savoir ce qui est psychédélique ou pas, c'est de comprendre que les frontières entre ce qui est considéré comme psychédélique ou pas sont poreuses, et qu'il n'y a pas tant de substances psychédéliques que d'expériences psychédéliques. On peut prendre un psychédélique et ne pas avoir d'expérience psychédélique, et on peut prendre quelque chose qui n'est absolument pas psychédélique et avoir une expérience qui révèle le contenu de l'âme. So what does that mean? If we say and if we admit together then we can have a psychedelic experience with a substance that it's not at all considered as psychedelic, means that there's something that is more important than the substance itself. And it's called set and setting, for example. It's also called the intention, and also the dose may play a very, 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 very big role. Then I will, as we are all probably familiar with many things about psychedelics here, I will go maybe a little bit quicker on that point. When we call something dangerous, what is it? So we try to rely on science maybe to say, how do science consider that something will be dangerous? So we took many criteria. Some of the criteria are the addictive factor of a substance. Another criteria may be it's the harm it does to the body. Another factor is the harm it does to the mind. And another factor may be the harm it does to the society. How do I behave? Am I violent under the influence of alcohol, or am I violent under the influence of cannabis or LSD? The answer is obvious. And what is interesting here in terms of notion of dangerosity, we have here a deadly substance, which is water. because you can die at the dose of 7 liters per hour. So water is very dangerous. At the same time, we eat the seeds of apples who contains cyanides, okay, which is one of the well-known most deadly poison, but we don't die. Cashew nuts, also the same. We don't die because the dose is not enough. So that's probably a good example. And Paracelsus, which is considered as the father of what we call modern medicine. I don't know what modern is here, but he said, everything is poison, nothing is poison. It's the dose that makes the poison.
Yes, of course, some people are allergic to cashews and a tiny amount kills them. So the individual variation is profoundly important compared to the generalization.
Yeah, thank you for underlying that, because we are not all equal towards a psychedelic substance.
By many orders of magnitude.
Yeah, yeah. So, for example, here is another criteria. It's the ratio between a substance that is considered a threshold and a dose that is considered as a threshold, and a dose that is considered deadly. So for heroin, it's 1 to 6. The deadly dose is very close to the threshold dose. But this graph, this diagram, I took it from its sources, and is actually wrong because it puts psilocybin and LSD as 1 on 1,000. So the reality behind that indicative number should be 1 on infinite, question mark, because we never killed anyone with a massive administration of LSD or psilocybin. We killed once an elephant with 3,000 dose. A dose is 100 microgram of LSD. In the 60s, he died from convulsions. But no human death has been reported due to amounts of absorption of LSD. The deaths that have been reported are due to the behavior that would be inappropriate under the influence of a substance. But under this single criteria, a ratio between threshold and deadly dose, it's always funny to say that LSD is much less lethal than aspirin or coffee. Another thing about the French situation, in red here, in French, like in many countries, we have the closest translation of the word stupéfiant is narcotics. And in France, we waited 50 years to define what is the word stupéfiant, which is here translated as narcotics, because we had a list of forbidden substance, but the definition of the list of the word narcotic or stupéfiant wasn't pronounced by the constitutional room in France. And so they say that stupéfiant / narcotic is a substance that is addictive and that has harmful effects on health. And so we have a list with substances that doesn't at all fall into the definition of narcotics and stupefying, which is our psychedelics. Because we see here that on a study made by David Nutt in 2007, when we take 16 criteria of dangerosity, we have the most dangerous substance of all that has been studied is alcohol. The second is heroin, and the third is crack cocaine. At the very bottom of this top rank, as this ranking, we have LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA. But another study also shows the same. This is a study of 2010. Alcohol comes always at first, heroin second, and crack cocaine third. And at the end, you find, again, MDMA, LSD, and psilocybin. So we can extrapolate a lot about this diagram, but it helps. In French, we have a proverb. It helps to make the church at the center of the village again. This is something, a sentence that doesn't exist in English, but in French we say that. To put things back in perspective in matters of what we may call dangerosity. So the spiritual dimension, the spirituality in the therapeutic dimension. So many studies show a correlation between the, I will tell it, spiritual score of an experience, because yes, even if it seems very surprising, there is a way to measure a spiritual experience, even if it's for some people nonsense. There is a scale, a questionnaire from Walter Stace that is asking to people 30 questions, and out of the question that you answer from 0 to 5, you have a spiritual score. And there is an obvious correlation that has been showed, saying that the more the experience is spiritual, the more it alleviates or heals the symptoms that the study is done for. And these studies were done for depression, terminal anxiety, addictions, and more than 40 others pathologies. A study of 2023 involving almost 1,000 participants states, the study states, the group that had the most insightful and mystical experience show the most benefits in terms of remission of symptom and anxiety, but also more sustainable benefits. So there is an obvious correlation. And then we have also a scientific review that is, how do we say that, reviewing 12 scientific studies about the association between the mystical experience and symptom reduction. And 10 of them established a significant correlation between the spiritual experience and symptom reductions. Then, when I talked about this questionnaire, this scale from Walter Stace, which is the MEQ 30, which allows to, let's say, to score the intensity of a mystical experience. Here is a study done by MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association on, for Psychedelic Studies, survey on ayahuasca. This study is a little biased because it was about ayahuasca drinkers. But when we asked them, is it a life-changing experience? We have 84% of people that are either agree or strongly agree. There were 130 questions, and so I just put out the questions that were making the biggest score, so we can, beyond the narrative of everyone, we can grasp a little bit with statistics, how does the experience feel? Is it mystical? 87%. Is it visual? 84%. And does it worth it? Almost 93%, which is always surprising when you know that basically you vomit a part of the night. But which is also interesting is does it give a gain of insightful knowledge at an intuitive level? I ask you to retain this information when we ask people, does ayahuasca give you insightful knowledge at an intuitive experience? We have 76% of the drinkers that say yes. There is a notion of acquiring knowledge with a brew, with something you drink, which can be surprising, like a teaching. So we will come back to that notion later. It's a very interesting notion, the notion of the feeling of being taught, the feeling of teaching. This I talked before as an introduction point, that when we think about dogma, we think, of course, about religion, but we have also dogma into science that tends to become scientism, which is not science anymore. And now I'm going to talk about the core of my topic, which is the role and the influence of entheogen and psychedelic in history. And we can start with prehistoric times. Here you can see 3 examples of cave art. And of course something jumps to the eye. there is a similarity, but what is really interesting is that the dates are very, how do we say that? Are not together. The dates are far apart, minus 36,000, minus 40,000, and minus 3,000 years ago, BC, sorry. And so it's obvious to say that none of these artists met each other. And one is in Canada, the other one is in Australia, and the other one is in Spain. But in the discipline of semiology, there is something that we call the intention of the sign. And we can ask ourselves, looking at this painting, what is the intention of the artist showing that something is coming out of the head, especially on the picture on the left. When we see bisons or elks or tigers paint on the wall, we don't ask ourselves question. If they paint it, they saw it. But let's apply this reasonment, this logic to the picture on the left, and then we could probably ask ourselves, what did they live? The other interesting part is that the common points on these three paintings is that they happen to be inside. Please feel how it was complicated to paint something inside in the dark when you had to do a fire, which means smoke. So if it had done be inside, something must have happened in that thing. So prehistorian today and specialists of cave art there is a consensus that is growing out and saying these are attempts to transmit the feeling of a psychedelic experience. And when I say psychedelic experience, doesn't mean mandatory the ingestion of psychedelic substance, but mind-expanding substance. So what's interesting here is the transculturality, the transversality beyond space and time about the nature of something spiritual that with or without psychedelic, we may feel that it has approximately the same feeling. Another example is here, mushroom head people. Same, we have a transcultural feeling, a transversal feeling when we see that there were these people were not living at the same time and not at the same place. And I bring you, let's say, 3000 BC. And we have a big geographical zone that extends itself from the Mediterranean area to the north of India. And between 3000 BC and 2005 BC, there have been the birthing of the first proto-monotheistic religions. And all these religions had something in common. We can call that a sacrament, something that you drink or eat, and apparently that makes you meet, I don't know, God, the spirit, the soul, whatever you may call it. So in Iran, there was a religion called Zoroastrism, and Zoroastrism has a book, and the book is called Avesta. In this book we have the yasna, and in the yasna they drink soma. The prophet of Zoroastrism is drinking, sorry, not soma, haoma, because the word is very close. And haoma, there was, and everybody can read that, opening the translation, finding the translation of yasna online. When you drink haoma, the plant, which is also a brew, which is also a god, is teaching you. At the same time, in northern India, we have the Vedism. And Vedism has also its little book, which is the Vedas. Inside the Vedas, you have the Rig Veda. In the Rig Veda, you have more than 100 hymns to Soma. And you can hear the proximity, phonetic proximity between Soma and Haoma. And also, Soma is at the same time a brew, a plant, and a god. And also Soma can teach. And at the same time, in Egypt, you have some cults which are called mystery cults, where the center is often Bes, which is the god of fertility. And we found in these how to call that, in these mugs, which is displaying the head of Beth, some residues of Peganum harmala. Peganum harmala is, so to say, the Middle East ayahuasca. So ayahuasca, as everyone knows, has MAOI, inhibitors of monoacidose, that helps the DMT to stay in the body. It has a certain amount of harmaline, which is the name of the molecule. But Peganum harmala has most of the time 2 or 3 times more of harmalines. So we can say that harmala, Peganum harmala, which is in English Syrian rue, more potent in terms of DMT inhibition, more potent than ayahuasca. And also, it's a high suspicion that in the Middle East they mixed Peganum harmala with either ayahuasca nilotica or ayahuasca confusa, which are 2 acacia which contains more DMT than the original chacruna. So the specialists today call this experience that may have come from the mixing, from the synergic action between Peganum harmala and some species of mimosa or acacia, and I don't know all of them, more potent than ayahuasca, the same synergic dynamic, and they call that anahuasca. And actually, from as far as we know, anahuasca is more ancient than ayahuasca. It's maybe not true, but we didn't find a proof for the otherwise. And at the same time, around the Mediterranean area, especially Spain, Greece, Turkey, we have other mystery cults. The most famous is Eleusis, and Eleusis, we have a 1-week initiation. And the legends, not the legend, but the historian who were writing about Eleusis said that people come from all Europe to walk as a pilgrimage to Eleusis, which was very close to Athens. And we had to fast, which is kind of amusing when we think about the diet before ayahuasca. For Eleusis, we had also to fast. And the common point between Haoma, Soma, the rites in Egypt and Kikeon is the purging. There was purging happening. We can read that every people who write about this theurgic experience, it was about fasting or observing a certain ascetic behavior, and also purging happened. And there is also a notion of being taught, of a teaching. I will make a short zoom on the mystery cults in Eleusis. It was we could have death penalty if you said too much about Eleusis, but there are some like Plato, Cicero, who wrote about what happened at Eleusis, and for them it was about dying before dying. And this is also something very common in all cults, in all religion, the promise between all these practice or institutions or traditions is immortality. It's always about finding something beyond life and to be immortal. And so we will understand that, of course, the promise of every spiritual or transcendental tradition to be immortal is not to not die, is to see that when the ego dies, something is still living. So the immortality is not about not dying, it's about realizing that our deep nature is immortal beyond the physical body. And of course, in Eleusis, the sacred brew that was drank the last day of this week, and that helped you to die, we found out 30 years ago thanks to discipline like archaeochemistry or archaeobotanics, than in the, how do we call that, the remains of the cups that were used at Eleusis, we found ergot. And ergot, rye ergot, is a fungus that grows on many cereals, not only on rye, but on many cereals. It's called Claviceps purpurea, and of course, that's the fungus from which in 1938 came the discovery by Haber Hoffman of LSD. So there is a very, very high probability that these people who were to Eleusis had a psychedelic experience on the last day after a week of fasting, which can also help. Also, later than Vedism, we had something called the Brahmanism, which is the ancestor of Hinduism. And in the Brahmanism, the texts were called, the founding texts were called Upanishads. And in Upanishads, we have the birth of proto-yoga, the ancestor of yoga, which is a group, so to say, of disciplines, of different practice that were done in order to achieve, let's call it, enlightenment. And so we have a Sanskritist in 2001, I will try to translate, that says the roots of yoga find themselves partially into the first Indian quest of transcendence through rituals and psychoactive substance and asceticism. So at that time, we are approx minus 1,500 in India, in the Upanishad, and the religion was Brahmanism. The yoga was totally undissociable, not discriminable from psychoactive substance. Another statement that comes from many authors is that in Brahmanism we had more than 160 rituals that were done on a public place. And the Brahman, one of the most important ritual was the confection, the preparation of soma, and was done publicly. And another thing is that the consumption of soma was one of the 6 techniques of the proto-yoga, like asceticism, incantation, which means chanting, invocation, the control of the breath, chastity, and isolation. So we had basically 6 techniques, but what's here interesting is that history shows us that yoga is something very different from what we have today in the Sunday morning in a room in a city on our small carpet. Yoga was once totally not separable from ingesting sacred or teacher plants. More recently, what we consider as the first form of modern yoga, the Sutras of Patanjali. When you open the book, the Sutras of Patanjali, the first sentence of the 4th chapter, he says the siddhi, which are the powers that the yogi is looking for. The siddhis are either you have them at the beginning of life, or they are given by the ingestions of plants, the singing of mantras, or practice of yoga discipline or meditation. So here again, 1,000 years later, when Patanjali, whoever it is, because we don't know who he is, wrote the first text about what we call modern yoga, again, plants were not different than the practice of meditation or chanting or yoga. A more modern author, Ganga White, which is a modern contemporary yogi, says no exploration of yoga and meditation would be complete without a look on the ancient tradition of plants and sacred herbs, for which, for many of us, is at the origin of the spiritual and religious experience. And here you have example of divinities in Hinduism and Brahmanism that are represented with mushroom. We have, I don't know the English word for it, but an over-representation of mushrooms and deity between the 6th and the 13th century, essentially north of India. And also in Tibetan Buddhism. In Tibetan Buddhism, you have something that is called Dzogchen. Dzogchen is the esoteric branch of Tibetan Buddhism. and it's like Kabbalah for Judaism, or Sufism for Islam, or Gnosticism for Christianity. Dzogchen is the esoteric branch of Tibetan Buddhism. In the path of Dzogchen, you have a ritual at the end, just before Rigpa. Attaining Rigpa, it's an immanent enlightenment, which is not transcendental. There is a ritual that it's called Drübchen. In the Drübchen, you have little pills, which is called Mendrup. And the Mendrup is known to help attain Rigpa. And the Dalai Lama comes from a lineage who, the monastery where the lineage comes from, holds secret a recipe of Mendrup since 11th centuries. Another anecdote which is funny is that in Sanskrit we had no name for umbrella. The name for umbrella was mushroom. And that may be a funny interpretation why we see so many deities with umbrellas. Of course, not because they need to protect themselves from the sun, but probably an attempt to stylize, to propose a very stylistic interpretation of the word mushroom. Yeah. And then the Bible. Here you have a drawing of the episodes of Ezekiel. If you open the Bible at Ezekiel, it's really easy to access. You have the story of a guy that sees a wheel of metal coming down from the sky in big noise. And once the wheels of metal comes close to the ground, we have beings with 4 faces and 8 wings that comes out, and that gives message to Ezekiel in terms of image. So either like me, you have been, so to say, educated in a religious context and you think this really happened, or either like it's happening in a ethnobotanics specialist in Tel Aviv like Benny Shannon, you think that Ezekiel was high as fuck. And so that comes from a theory that we call the entheogenic Bible. The entheogenic Bible theory relies on the realization that in the Bible you have 206 plants, essentially expressed in Hebrew. So not all of these plants have been identified, but there is a consensus among the botanists that says, yeah, we know like 90 of them, we found the source of 90 of them. And on these 90 plants, we have approximately the half that is psychoactive. What was medicine at that time, if not the usage of plant? And we had a guy who was walking on water at that time, and his name is in Greek, because he's only named in Greek, never in Hebrew, is Iesos. And Iesos comes from iatros, which is doctor in Greek. And doctor, iatros, comes from poison, ios. So the word Iesos comes from poison and doctor. At 4 occurrences, at 4 times, he describes himself in the Bible as a medicine man. What was medicine at that time, if not the usage of plant? The word Christ, etymologically speaking in Greek, means the ointed one, the one who received anointment, which is the application of an oil. And here we have many extracts from the Bible, and I read, Samuel took the oil and anointed David in the midst of his brother, and the spirit of Yahweh, so to say God, fell on David from that day. This is in Samuel. Another extract, John, very interesting. The anointing that you received from him remains in you, which put a smile on people's face when they know what ayahuasca does. But the anointing, you don't need to be taught, but his anointing teaches you all things. So we speak in the Bible about an oil that teaches, again. And we have an apocryph, gospel, For those who not know, an apocryph is a text that has not been selected to be part of the Bible, probably because they were too much controversial. And Philip says in this gospel, which has the same historical value as the Bible, he say, the one who received the ointment is not anymore a Christian, but becomes a Christ. Because the one who received the ointment possesses everything, he has the resurrection. And again, we find the notion of immortality into it. An interesting information is that when Moses goes on the Mount Sinai to receive orders from the big boss, he also receives, and you can read it at Exodus 30:23, he received the recipe of the ointment. And God told to Moses, you will take olive oil, you will take myrrh, you will take cinnamon, and you will take cannabosm. Cannabosm in Hebrew, in French in English we call that cannabis. Cannabosm, cannabis. Okay, cannabis is mentioned more, I think, I don't want to say something wrong, but mentioned more than 6 times in the Bible. But the plant that is mentioned the most of the time in the Bible is acacia, which contains huge amount of DMT, 23 times. But acacia is also very central in the Egypt myth. But also we have incense in the Bible. Incense, Moses also receives a recipe of incense. In ancient Egypt there was a psychoactive incense that it's called kufi, which was highly psychedelic. And then we have many other brews throughout history. We have Eucharisti, Pharmakon, Amrita, which literally means Amrita in the Buddhism. The etymology of Amrita means non-death. And Ambrosia in the Greek mythology, mead amongst the druid also. And we have a bishop very close to the existence of Jesus time-wise speaking. He talks about the Eucharist as the drug of immortality. Pharmakon athanasias. And pharmakon athanasias means it's an antidote and a poison at the same time, and it generates eternal life. So that's how we spoke about Eucharisty. We are very far from what you can get in a church today. And we had also a doctor which was contemporary, living at the same time of Jesus, Dioscoride, who wrote a book with 56 recipes of wine. We have to understand that wine 2000 years ago has absolutely nothing in common with the wine of today, which has a function of social lubricant or a gastronomic function. At that time, wine was not discernible from medicine and sacrament. It has a spiritual function, and you can all consult this book of Dioscoride, which contains the recipe of wine, which we can find mandrake, datura, belladonna, acacia, many psychedelic plants in almost every recipe. What is also interesting is that time wine, of course, the basis of wine was the juice of fruit, not only grape. But what is really interesting is that we discovered the measurement, how to measure alcohol 18 centuries later. So it was not about alcohol. And here you have some example of psychedelics represented in the Christian religion, especially in the Roman art between the 9th and the 13th century here in France, which is also very important than the represented people that are representing amongst suspicious mushrooms, which are not portobello, of course. They have an aureola around the head. And we can ask ourselves, how would you represent someone who is high? And many specialists many writers, are putting forward this theory that, of course, it's well known that when you show this halo behind the head of someone is to represent the holiness, but we can also explore the fact that holiness was enhanced by sacred substances. Here you have other examples which are depicting the genesis between Adam and Eve, and you can see the snake, which always puts a smile on the face of ayahuasca consumers. And the story was to Adam and Eve, if you eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, then you get out of the paradise. And the snake tells Eve in the book, you will certainly not die if you eat it, because God knows that the day you will eat it, your eyes will open and you will be like God. Oops. Other examples where mushroom is still here. This is in the Cathédrale de Chartres. Other example, Notre-Dame de Paris, where we can see an interesting, so to say, assembling between a plant and a man, like the plant could speak. Or maybe the man is a plant, I don't know.
Tu peux montrer la cathédrale de Chartres devant?
Oui. It's the right one.
Where's the mushroom?
In the center. But we can ask ourselves, maybe it's not, I don't know. It's interesting to see and ask ourselves what is the role of that. And how would we represent a tree if we wanted to represent a tree? Of course, witchcraft, before being called sorcerers, which is the word that Charlemagne, which was a French emperor in the 10th century, Charlemagne called some people sorcerers. The people, etymologically, people who were giving and making curse, accusing them to provide false Eucharisty. Who were these people, if not Occidental herborists, if not our ancestor shamans? What is someone 1,000 years ago who plays or heal or communicate with plant, if not a shaman? So before calling them witchcraft and sorcery, which is a name that is 1,000 years old, factually in a very basic approach, they were Western shaman. Okay, so we have a tradition that has been forgotten. And we have endemic psychedelic, which are a little bit more dangerous than the psychedelic we saw at the beginning of this talk, which are mandrake, black henbane, belladonna, which can be quickly very deadly. So they probably had means and techniques to be able to get in touch with these teacher plants without dying, but we probably lost most of the knowledge because 80,000 women were burned between the 10th and the 17th century. And when you burn someone like this, it's like you burn a library at the same time. Huh? But we know that they used to craft ointment because these plants were too dangerous for the inner system, so the skin would filter most of the dangerous substances. So ointment were the main vessel, the main technique to get in touch with these plants. Is someone here, Marion, please don't cheat, is someone here that knows this logo here? Yeah. When I ask that in Belgium or in France, nobody knows. You can have 300 persons in the room, nobody raised a hand. So, of course, Reinheitsgebot is known to be one of the first, not the first, but one of the first law on food ever. And what does it say? It has been in Munich, and basically, to make it short, it says this is beer, and beer, if you want to call it beer, if you want to make beer, you have to put, how is the plant, the hop? In German? Hopfen. So beer is now, since 1516, made from hops. That was making how do we say that? That was giving a lot of benefits to the church because the church was the only institution to tax hops. But also what is really interesting, if you open this Reinheitsgebot and you read it, it also tells all the plants that are now forbidden. And in these plants who are forbidden, you have Acora calamus, which is well known as a psychedelic. You have mandrake, you have some water lilies that are also psychedelics. We have to understand that before that time, and even at that time, beer was not a social drink. It was the core of the meal, and people were putting bread on it. Sometimes bread was also a bit too old and it has ergot in it. That's how we got epidemic of craziness and dancing, like in Strassbourg in 1518, which is a mass contamination of ergotism. But at that time we didn't know ergot, so we call that the fire of Saint Antoine, and sometimes le mal des ardents, which I cannot translate. But before ergotism, it has also meanings that were more religious, and we used this contamination, global contamination, to say you have sinned. But also, so this food law is one of the proof that beer was sometimes mind-enhancing or probably entheogenic. And we have also to realize that most of the beer at that time was made into monastery by monks. And on the next we can understand why monks were painting such things. Because when we read about angels in the Bible, they are never like this. Never. Never. The Bible in the angels are like machine with eyes. This is the biblical accurate angel. If you want to look for it on Google, you type biblical accurate angel. It's made of metals and it has many eyes. And it's the meeting of an entity in the Bible. Here, the monks, so the Middle Ages, the obscurantism of modern Catholicism depicts the angel and the demon that way. It's another way to depict the entities. Nowadays, when we smoke DMT and we have a phenomenological approach of the entities that people depict under the influence of DMT, we have mechanical elves and aliens. It's normal in a culture where we are influenced by Hollywood movies about aliens and elves. So what is the message between that? Is that throughout the ages, we always have meetings with external and intelligent entities, but the depiction, the representation of them is heavily influenced by the culture. Another thing which is very interesting to add a little bit more weight on entities and all that, we have someone called Rick Strassman who worked a lot on the phenomenological approach of the DMT experience, and he has wrote a Bible which is called the Bible Prophecy. So Rick Strassman depicts himself as a specialist of the Ancient Testament, especially in the Judaic religion, and he brought up what it needs to be considered as a prophet. To be considered as a prophet in a religion, religiously wise, you have 40 items, around 40 items that you have to check, and for the religion which concerns says you are a prophet and this is a prophecy. He did the same with DMT, and he saw overlapping on 90% of the items that is similar on the phenomenology of the DMT experience and the prophetic experience. So these experiences, phenomenologically speaking, are very close. Here is a tree of religion. This is let's call it a positive reductionism. We have today 25,000 religions on Earth. And this shows like a synthetic approach of the building of religion. At the bottom of this graph, you have shamanism and animism, which is dated here 100,000 BC. And of course, we all know it's much, much, much older. But everything comes from here. And then you can see that every religion is birthing from that common trunk. And on the top, you have the most recent religion, like Reformed Judaism, like polytheism, pagan polytheism, Altaic polytheism, and so you can have an overview on the religion. And I worked a little bit for you, and I put a green spot on every religion where we have the factual proof of the use of an entheogenic sacrament. When I wasn't sure, I put a yellow spot. But in every green spot, we have the scriptural or academic proof of the usage of a sacrament at the center of a ritual. So we can see also that the usage, the consumption of an entheogen is not an exception, it's the norm.
Could you say it used to be the norm? It seems like in the
better. It used to be the norm. And I like this metaphor. I like this picture. Someone who has enough of his ego meets the spiritual ego. And in the forbidden wisdom, some people always ask me, yeah, but meditation, you can have a spiritual experience, but also with psychedelic. Do we really need psychedelic? So I put it that way. I call that the path and the destination. There is a metaphor I always take. Most of us are looking for either freedom or healing or enlightenment. And the metaphor is we are climbing the Everest. Okay? And as we know, the Everest is insanely hard to climb, and there is a lot of dead people over there, because most of us will never reach the top, and we will die trying. Okay? Most of us will die without achieving enlightenment. Okay? So the Everest is a nice metaphor. And so if you want to climb the Everest, you have to have good clothes, a good physical condition, but it has also to be progressive, because over there, on the top, there is almost no oxygen. And this is meditation. This is the spiritual path. We are trying to get there, and we acclimate slowly ourselves doing so, and we may die during the process because life ends before we reach the top. Psychedelics and entheogen is the helicopter that takes you and puts you directly on the top of the mountain. So that sounds fantastic, but let's take the example of a child who never asks anything, who never starts the way, and finds itself taken by a helicopter, maybe against his will, parachuted on the top of the Everest. First of all, I am cold, I want to see my mother, I cannot breathe, and he may lose some toes in the process. So what does that metaphor say? It says that the psychedelic experience, the ego-dissoluting psychedelic experience, the very total one, may be eventually dangerous for people who are not prepared, who have not the good clothes, who have not been acclimated or used to rarefaction of oxygen. So I always say, and it is provocative to some ears, that the two goes together. If you want to reach something, meditation and psychedelics goes together. One doesn't go without. If you want to have a recreational moment, or if you have a meditative moment, it can go together. But there is a way that is not common, but has been very, 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 very common in the older age. Ascetic, meditative practice mixed with the wisdom of sacred and teacher plants. And then, thank you. And then we reach slowly the end. I was explaining the concept of immortality, and I wanted to share these funny pictures on the right. A kid telling his father, well, at your age, I didn't believe neither in incarnation, reincarnation. And we have 2 Nobel Prizes who dedicated their Nobel Prize to LSD. We have Francis Crick, who had the Nobel Prize for discovering the helicoidal structure of DNA, and he declared to a journalist just after the prize that he was high on LSD when he discovered this helicoidal structure. And Karim Ellis later received the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the PCR, which is a replication method of DNA, and he declares, what if I had not taken LSD ever? Would I still have invented PCR? I don't know. I seriously doubt it. And I always like to finish on that picture. Thank you for listening, and we can have a 30-minute moment of questions. Thank you.